we've argued and we've shown there what the benefits are for children in terms of education, growth, etc., etc. And I've said that for us to make a case to our Ministry of Finance in South Africa, we've had to show the positives. And of course, from the other flip side, I said they did not want to hear about poverty and its impact and its consequences. Not that they were oblivious, but it wasn't sufficient to make an argument. We had to say, economically, how does it benefit the country? Now, I'm going to be provocative. Within South Africa, there was another angle, and that was it had to be about the rights. Quite frankly, it was not our argument. For us, it wouldn't have been, in my view at least, a way to try and convince. But there are other people, and I see the NGO people smiling. No, we didn't care about the rights perspective. We argued for the benefit of the child. But Professor Kaseke has been involved in this area of work and social protection, and why it is important to look at it from a rights-based perspective. So Prof. Kaseke, Prof. Welington, you can also join in on this topic, on the rights-based approach and why it's important.
Thank you very much. I think the human rights approach is very critical in the sense that it affirms the need for us to promote human dignity. And I think that is very critical. You cannot promote human dignity unless you enable those individuals and families to meet their basic needs and create opportunities for them to realize their potential. And I think what we are saying is that it just doesn't happen on its own. There is need for an interventionist state which allows people to develop in that sense. And we are also saying that the human rights perspective actually is given expression in the various international, regional, and national human rights instruments. And basically, therefore, that approach is in line with those international, regional, and national human rights instruments. But what is also more important is the fact that when you're talking about human rights, you are also saying that you are creating a basis on which you can actually enable people to realize their full potential. And I think for us, this is very critical. Creating opportunities through which people can realize their full potential in life. And also by so doing, you're able also to address some of the pitfalls associated with the traditional approach to social protection, where then you have the problem of stigmatization. All right? And so it is very critical. But I think also another important dimension of it is that by adopting a human rights perspective, you're also holding governments accountable. All right? So that governments are accountable. They have the responsibility and the obligation to ensure the realization of those basic human rights. But not only being accountable, but there must be mechanisms through which you can enforce that basic human right. I think this is where we find problems in many countries in Africa. In terms of the national instruments, there is no basis upon which you can enforce the right to social security, for instance, which is very different from the South African situation where the Constitution actually provides the basis for enforcement. And finally, we are also saying that, when you talk about a human rights perspective, you are also trying to get governments move away from the very easy, practice whereby they try to abdicate, from their responsibility. Because very often when you talk about social security or social protection as a basic human right, you are saying, therefore, there is a notion of entitlement, right? Which comes by virtue of the fact that you are a citizen or a human being in that particular society. So if you are talking about the notion of entitlement, then you're also saying that the government has an obligation to ensure that people realize, their basic human rights. And I think for me, that is very essential.
Thanks, Prof. Kaseke. And I'm going to come back to the idea of entitlement versus financial capacity or fiscal capacity to do it in a moment, Prof. But Prof. Welington, your take on a human rights angle to providing social protection?
Yeah, I think it's actually a reflection of the thinking in the world just now. I mean, if you take it right through from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you look at the declaration not only of human rights, but you look at economic rights, you look at the rights of the child, you look at the rights of women, there is the whole issue of ensuring that people are given adequate capacity to realize not only their full potential, but also to have dignity in their lives. And one of the obvious detractions from human dignity is the depth of poverty, which exists in a good part of Africa. And it is part of that challenge that the human rights approach to social protection seeks to address. But then the human rights approach would suggest a degree of universality in the provision of social security benefits. But then this is where the challenge becomes even clearer from the point of view of the inadequacies in our part of the world. Because you can see that governments in our part of the world, firstly, social protection is a new phenomenon for most African countries outside of the traditional systems. But formal social protection is a comparatively new thing. I mean, the colonial times did not address social security for the vast population. They looked only at that small segment that was in the colonial civil service who had pensions and some benefits. But the challenge is now, how do you bring about this human rights dimension in providing social security for the vast population?
Can I lead the way to us speaking about that challenge? I currently work in a country, and my colleagues are here from Uganda, where in order to meet their small fiscal budget for the government to pay for infrastructure, education, healthcare, just to meet it, they rely on donor money to fund a 20% of that budget. And at the same time, there's acknowledgement that there needs to be better provision for children, and they don't have a benefit for children yet, except for a small number. So how do we find a balance when that is, and that's not only Uganda, it's a number of African countries, fiscal constraints are a real issue, and we'll come to the ILO's argument in a moment. But let's first, how do we balance giving expression to that rights and human dignity when the state itself doesn't have the fiscal resources? Prof?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that what has happened in many countries, for instance, is that the absence of adequate resources has been used as a justification for inaction. And I think we need to underline that. And I think the most important point to understand also is the very fact that there will always, problems in terms of resources. We will never have a situation where we're saying we have too much resources. Resources will always be limited. But the question is, what are we doing with the limited resources to our disposal? And I think it speaks to a number of issues, okay? One is the whole issue of prioritization. Are we having our priorities right? Are we spending our limited resources on areas that have a bearing in terms of improving the overall quality of life of our people? And secondly, also the issue of political will. Do we have the political will actually to be able to ensure that the little few resources that we have are used in the interest of promoting human well-being? And I think that is the problem.
Okay, priorities and political will. I'm going to allow Prof. Wellington quickly, and then I'm going to come to Alex on, the ILO has made an argument that it's affordable, and get his perspective on it, because I've argued against that point of view. Please, Prof. Please.
Yeah, I'll very quickly talk about this whole issue of government's approach to the provision of social security and to development in general. We should not forget that social protection is only one dimension of the wider spectrum of growth, development, and poverty reduction. And approaches to these issues might differ in terms of the philosophy and perspectives of various governments. Some might feel that perhaps if you improve on infrastructure, if you improve on basic production possibilities, then you have the possibility of improving on social protection through the mechanism of growth and development itself. But then there is the question of what one had called the failure of the so-called trickle-down economics, that if you have growth and development, then benefits will trickle down to the rest of the population. This, I think, has been empirically proved not to be the case. And that calls for the intervention that governments have to make in order to ensure that there is a better spread of the benefits of growth and development in the economy and a greater degree of equity. But then the whole issue of resources comes into the picture. Because, I mean, even from the presentations we've seen this morning, and the literature is replete with evidence from various other countries, most of the programs we are seeing are essentially pilot programs. They are not full-scaled programs, and they are targeted, which really reflects the human rights dimension of progressive realization.
Okay.
Because of the
Prof, an
inadequacy
important point, and we're going to come back to the issue of scalability. We wanted to get a sense on, balancing the expression to human rights vis-a-vis fiscal, and I think you've touched on the fiscal element. Prof. Alex, affordable in African countries at the current moment when some of them do not have the resources to fund a basic budget?
Well, the first question is whether or not the constraint is genuine, because in many cases, let's say if I had an example from South Africa, one thing quite recently that I've heard from senior policymakers from within the presidency from the past 10 years is that inequality is a consequence of economic growth. Now, if you had to accept that as a principle, then you're actually accepting inequality as a driver of growth, and you're seeing it in a positive light. The reality is that inequality is a policy choice. It's not actually a consequence of growth. It can be a consequence of growth, as one has seen from the numbers that Brenton had presented. Internationally, if you had to allow most of the developed countries to eliminate their transfer programs, they would be deeply unequal societies. And part of the consequence of that is that you entrench inequality permanently, and that certain people are permanently advantaged and other people are permanently disadvantaged, and it becomes systemic. That is not a healthy condition for a society. So the issue is the extent to which it is a policy choice rather than truly an affordability question. The question is what proportion of the resources generated within society should actually go to balancing an income gap and making sure that people at the bottom end, many of whom are there just by chance rather than by choice or their own behavior, the extent to which you need to permanently dedicate resources to that end of society to ensure that the base is created for healthy development and growth. The other issue is whether or not equality generates growth. Greater equality and development at that level, there's the issue of a trade-off is a false notion. In fact, equality generates better development and growth and faster development and growth and better development and growth. And growth that is at the cost of some people is in fact not healthy and not desirable. And I think that is really where I see a lot of this fiscal constraint coming in, is where people actually do believe that inequality is a valid contributor to economic growth, and therefore they're creating excuses not to actually balance society.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Mary, your take on affordability, and I think maybe whilst you're at it, speak to the fact that even if you argue that it's affordable in a given year, we know that we go through boom times and times when the economy does not serve us that well. And the issue of sustainability in times of financial crisis also comes to the fore, because one of the things that governments fear, if it's a works program, it can be stopped at some point. Social protection, how after 10 years of implementing it, do you just withdraw it without creating a bigger political challenge? So if you argue that it's affordable, is it sustainable? And how long is it sustainable for?
Selwyn, I wanted to refer to the presentation made by Winnie, where the government of Kenya in 2013 and 2014 doubled its allocation to social protection. Was the money there? Were the funds there? did the money come from somewhere, or is it political will? Just going back to Professor Kaseke's point, are we having leaders in our countries that are willing to invest in people? Are we having leaders who are balancing between infrastructural development and social development? I think those are key questions that we need to ask our leaders. Do they see social protection as investment, or do they see social protection as a drain to the economy? And these are questions we grapple with in our country in terms of what are the economic returns from social protection. And therefore, we go back to the issue of what evidence are we generating to convince governments that there are economic returns to investing in the people we are talking about. The issue of sustainability has also been used by political elites to argue against social protection, especially cash transfers. How long? For how long are we going to be giving people money? For how long are we going to be giving people social transfers? So when we begin to ask the issue of sustainability, it's a matter of asking the same people what they are doing to ensure that the people living under the poverty line no longer are under the poverty line as we address the issue of sustainability. So in terms of affordability, as Prof says, it's possible, it's affordable, if there is political will, and if we plan in the long term, not according to political life of the leaders in the office. We are not planning because I'll be a president for 5 years and I want to be re-elected. We are planning because we are looking into the long term.
Dr.
And this is what we don't have.
Let's concede that it may be affordable. Let's concede it is sustainable. But aren't we creating real dangers for ourselves? And someone asked a question, and I need to repeat it. You have a certain section of the population in poverty. Now you hand out free healthcare, free education, free benefits. In one sentence, aren't we creating dependency? Someone asked that question, and I think we need to respond to it in a little more detail. Briefly, and one of the other colleagues can also answer, please.
The evidence shows, the research evidence shows we are not creating dependency. So that is in one word. We cannot also fall prey to people who question social protection that it is creating dependency. There's evidence that if you support a group of people, the problem has been graduation. For how long? And somebody else asked, are we graduating from poverty, or are we graduating people from insecurity? So as we answer that question, I think we can throw this to the audience. Are we creating dependence? Is there evidence in your countries that you are creating dependence? Because politicians throw this question to us all the time. We will make people dependent. Handouts are not a useful way of getting people out of poverty. Are we creating dependence? I will throw that back to the audience.
All right, the last time I checked, we were serving the politicians as senior officials, and we were part of the political elite. But let me hear other views, because I'm going to come back to some of those issues. Prof. Welington.
The evidence so far is that we are not creating dependency with social protection. That is what the literature tells us, that's what studies have told us. But talking about dependency and affordability, etc., we have to be a bit more nuanced in these kinds of things. Because affordability, as colleagues have been saying, seems to be essentially a political choice. There's no question of inadequacy of resources. I'm an economist, and we always talk about the cost of the alternative. And money you spend on social security or on social protection can be spent in other areas. And this is where the balance you're talking about
I've agreed, Prof. I've agreed it's affordable. I've agreed it's sustainable.
Well, I'm not even sure that affordability
dependency is a problem.
It's such a clear-cut thing. But as I say, there is a political choice as to what is affordable or not, because it might mean that you have to review your expenditure program, cut off
I have
something.
conceded that it may be affordable and sustainable. I said, but does it not have other perverse or unintended consequences? And I'd like Prof to speak to that issue.
Well, do you want me or him?
Anyone. Unintended. Let me tell you, and I've said it, in South Africa, the issue was raised 2003 that because the benefit is available to young mothers, our birth rates are shooting up. Young girls are getting pregnant to get a benefit. What do you say to that argument?
Well,
Because that's what people, the political elite, fear.
Essentially, social protection is a redistribution program.
Right.
It's essentially a redistribution program.
Okay.
And depending on the levels at which you pitch your benefits,
Okay.
you can have perverse reactions.
Okay.
I mean, the advanced countries are seeing some of this even as we speak.
Thank
They
you.
are
Prof. I'm going to
revising.
get a red card. Alex, quickly on the issue of perverse incentives.
Yeah, first of all, South Africa's fertility rates have been systematically declining through the introduction of the biggest social grant system it has ever had. So theoretically, if there were incentives to generate additional births, it would have been detectable in an increase in birth rate, and we don't have that. In terms of the trade-off, the issue is whether or not one is generating capability or dependency. All the evidence is showing that it's generating additional capability at the levels at which it has been introduced, and at increasing levels we will probably get further capability for what we're buying. There is a point at which you're likely to have significant perverse incentives at very, very high levels, depending on what the benefit is. But it's like saying, is somebody who's being subsidized by their parents to go to an expensive private school, what perverse incentive does that child have for that excessive transfer in their respect? The reality is most of these transfers are going into publicly funded programs that are providing benefits that other people are providing within their families.
Thank you very much. I wish to ask your indulgence for 2 minutes, because one of the issues we brought up is this issue about political will, as if we are entirely detached from it, as if there is a group of people out there. So please help me. Let's assume there's a group of people out there and they make the decisions. What is it that we need to do to influence it so that policymakers, Wiseman like to say that we the policymakers, so that those who make the political decisions at the highest level move in the direction of more expansion of social protection? In 1 or 2 sentences, my time is up, so I'm going to have to interrupt you if you go on too long, Prof.
Well, I think essentially there is a matter of education and awareness raising and advocacy, essentially. There have been studies which have shown that you don't have perverse effects arising from social protection. And I think we have to demonstrate this, that social protection is not only expenditure on people, but it's also investment in people, which enhances their capacity for improved productivity. So it should be seen from that perspective, and we should convince the decision makers of the investment effect and the consequent enhancement of capacity that arises from that investment in the people who benefit from it.
Thank you,
I think
Prof.
That might
We
be
have
the
a job
approach,
to do. Alex?
Awareness raising and advocacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the politicians are only part of a process of social contract development. They are not the exclusive process. They are not sovereigns sitting above everybody else and everybody else subjects. The issue is that society must be part of the process of determining its values and what is then formalized within its rights-based frameworks as to what would be, and its institutions as to what would be developed as government programs. And so the issue there is the extent to which society is actually involved in setting these values and making these choices. So politicians are one part of that. They're quite sensitive to what people actually feel out there, and they do react to it. And if the general environment is unresponsive to their key needs, they will be unresponsive too. So the issue is actually what does it take to make sure that there is a proper social process that people are involved in setting these values, and what creates that? And it can't just be government.
Thank you, Alex. Dr. Mary.
I think the issue of impact and evidence. How are we generating the evidence? How are we packaging the evidence? How are we communicating the evidence? Most of our programs are pilot, and pilots are meant to generate evidence. But where does that evidence sit? How do we ensure that that evidence informs policy and informs programming? So the gap between translating that evidence into policy remains, and communication in a language that all of us can understand, we as politicians, as implementers, and as communities. How are we communicating to people to actually inform societies to ensure that they hold their governments accountable in a manner that then benefits them as recipients, as beneficiaries of social protection programs? So there's a problem with translating the evidence we have. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Mary. Prof?
I think what we need to understand is that policy making is not the sole responsibility of politicians. Policy making is a responsibility of different actors, and we are all part of that process. And I think it's a question of deciding on how are we going to influence the policy making process. And I think it's easy to blame the politicians, but what is our own responsibility as people who are supposed to influence the formulation of social policies? And so we need to look at the social policy process itself and how we can be part of the actors that actually influence policy making.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Regrettably, our time has expired. Give the panelists a round of applause before I make an announcement. That's indeed been very lively and assertive. I thought I could ask you some tough questions, but I forgot you are doctors and professors. Thank you very much.